Imagine that you're an alien from another planet, and your assignment is to come to Earth and figure out how people eat. So as soon as you get to Earth, you realize, wow, I'm in luck. There are these places that are uniquely designed for eating, and they're called restaurants. So what you're going to do to figure out how people eat is you're going to hang out at restaurants for a few months, and then you'll write your report, you'll send it back to your boss. So you hang out at restaurants for a few months, and you find out some really interesting things about how people eat. Here's some of the things that you found. People only eat on the hour or half hour. Whenever people come into restaurants, they only come in at 6 o'clock or 6:30 or 7. They never come in at 3:22. Secondly, people always eat in groups. They never seem to eat alone in restaurants. Third, all food is uniquely divided into different groups. You have your appetizers, you have your chicken dishes, your meat dishes. After all, that's how menus operate. And lastly, you find out that people don't cook. They probably can't cook, you figure. They just come into restaurants, people called cooks or chefs cook for them, and they bring the food out. You say, wow, this must be how human eating works. So you write your report, and fortunately for you, some friends that are Earthlings that you met along the way say, we would love to read your report to figure out if it's accurate before you send it off. They read it, and they come back to you. They say, I think there's a problem here. You looked at how people eat in restaurants, but those are only one place that people eat. People eat at a lot of places. They eat at cookouts, they eat at picnics. They usually eat at home, either at the table or in front of the TV or wherever it is. They eat at a lot of different places. And what is true about how people eat at restaurants isn't necessarily true about how people eat at all those other places. So I think we make a similar mistake to the alien when we think about how people learn. We assume that the way people learn in school is just the way people learn. We're used to school. School is natural for us. So when we think about learning, we think about people at desks. We think about them going to buildings called school. And I'm going to say that that's one place that people learn, but people learn in a lot of different places. They learn whenever they learn about a hobby. They learn whenever they're at home and they need to look something up on the computer and there's no teacher around. They learn when they're hanging out with their friends. And this is one of the things that I've spent several years now studying. I study how people learn outside of school, either when it's after school or people who don't go to school at all or even follow a formal curriculum, people we would call unschoolers. So in this presentation, I want to shatter 3 particular myths about schooling that we just widely have in terms of learning. The first is that we think that learning is best or can only be done at a place called school. False. Second, a teacher's job is to instill knowledge into students. False. Third, learning happens to be best done on a tight and a linear schedule. False. So let me explain these 3. The first myth I want to go over is that we generally think that learning is an activity we do at school, and that's just where all the information is. So we go to school because that's where the teachers are who are knowledgeable, that's where the books are, that's where the resources are, that's where all the activities are. And the truth is that information and learning can actually be done anywhere. I want to start with a quote by technology writer Clay Shirky. Now, this is not going to seem directly relevant to the point that we're making about school, but it actually is. So he's writing in 2011, and he says, when a profession has been created as a result of some scarcity, as with libraries or television programs, the professionals are often the last ones to see when that scarcity goes away. He's talking about television and libraries, and think about what was happening in the 2010s with both of these industries. In the 2010s, it was still kind of assumed that if you wanted news or media, you had to go to professional TV stations. Professional content providers would put their material on those TV stations, and that's where you went. Well, this was the age where YouTube and other media sites were coming up. So it wasn't any longer the case where if you wanted entertaining video, the best place or the only place to get it was TV. There's a lot of places. And libraries were kind of the same way. Libraries function on the idea that we have books on our shelves, and if people want information, the best way for them to get it is to come to us, get that information on our shelves, and then go back home. But this was really the rise of the internet, and the internet was becoming more and more available to more and more people. So it just was no longer the case anymore that people needed to go to libraries to get information. And I think the same thing is kind of true with school, if you think about it. I think most people are intimidated by home learning, partially because they think of learning as something that just happens in school, because that's where all of the knowledge is. That's where the teachers are. That's where the material is. That's where all the stuff is that's structured for learning. But if you think about school like we think about libraries and TV production in the 2010s, we should realize that there's a lot of places to learn stuff. So here's an example. If a student wants to learn, let's say, about snakes, in school, they raise their hand. They find out someone who knows about snakes. The teacher or the science teacher probably knows about snakes. If they don't, there are probably books that they can get that teach them about snakes. And that's the way most of us think that learning would have to happen. But today, there's more and more places that you can go, most of which are on the internet, about snakes and how they work. And this isn't just true of snakes, it's true of a lot of things. But I bring up the snakes example partially because an example illustrates my point. Fairly recently, my wife's son and I were on vacation, and we noticed a snake in a particular area. We didn't know what the snake was or if it was poisonous or not. We may have even learned what that snake was in school, and we just forgot. So if we were in the 1950s, 60s, maybe up until the 80s and 90s, we would have to find someone who knew about snakes, or we would have to go to the library and hope that there's something about snakes there. But what my wife did was that she went online and she very quickly found a snake enthusiast group on a social media page. And she gave a picture of the snake and asked if it was poisonous. And she got an answer within a few minutes. Some people telling her it wasn't poisonous. Here's the kind of snake it is. And to confirm, she took the name of the snake that they gave her, looked it up online, saw if the picture matched the picture she had, and it did. So within a few minutes, she looked online and she got her questions asked or answered. And there's really no reason why we can't do that and why kids can't do that with a lot of information. And it goes beyond snakes. If you want to learn something about a math skill, if you want to learn to analyze a Shakespearean sonnet or read a particular author or learn whatever it is, there's probably somewhere, especially online, that you can do that. But it isn't just online. Now let's think about where there are opportunities to learn different things. So we also think that school is valuable because that's where students have the opportunity to learn math and learn science and social studies. They get presented with word problems and things that give them an invitation to math. But if you think about it, there's a lot of invitations to learn math or social studies or anything just in the course of life. And I think we don't often think about them because we're so used to the idea that school is the place you do this. So math is a really interesting example. What I like to have my own students who are future teachers do is notice as many times as possible that you use math in a day or a few days or a week and write them down. And often the list is pretty surprising because there's a lot of ways that we use math that we don't even think about. Whenever we get some medicine for a headache or a cold or something, we're using math. If you notice, there's a word problem there. It says take so many per day, not to exceed this many per day, and only take this many per hour. Well, you have to do a certain amount of addition or subtraction to figure out how to do that. A lot of parents are concerned with video games, but if you think about video games and you look at a lot of video games, a lot of them have quite a bit of math. They're often point-based video games. And even, as my colleague Gina Riley likes to point out, Legos. Legos are math manipulatives. If you really look at Legos, they have a certain number of locks on each of their pieces. And a child, in order to create something, will often have to figure out, I need a piece that has 4 locks, or I need a piece that has 8 locks, or I have 12 locks that I need to fill up. So how can I get pieces that will fit that? So really, if you think about it, this is an invitation to learn addition, subtraction, multiplication, things like that. Another area is social studies. And social studies is an area that, again, if you think about it, is really all around us. It's easy to see when you look for it, all of the opportunities for people to get involved with social studies. There's obviously things going on in the news involving criminal justice, involving presidential elections, involving how governments can respond to various crises. There's a lot of interesting documentaries and just shows online that are very history-based in social studies space. So if you look on streaming services, like if you have access to Netflix or Hulu, or even just YouTube, there's a lot of things, even documentaries that you can find online. There's just watching the regular news and talking about the regular news. So that in combination with the internet will often give people a lot of invitation to study things like math, get interested in things like math, have to use things like math in social studies. So my suggestion is for us, as much as possible, to not think of school as a place that people go where all of the knowledge is, and start really getting used to the idea that knowledge and opportunities for learning are all around us. And I find that if you just try to get used to seeing the world a little bit differently as a place of a lot of learning opportunities and learning resources, that you can often be a lot more creative with your own practice. There's a second myth that I think somewhat flows from the first one. So even if we change our idea of how the outside of school world looks, that it's full of learning resources and it's full of learning opportunities, it's still pretty intimidating to think that we as parents and guardians, our job is now to teach kids things that teachers used to teach. But I think this is because we have a little bit of a misguided view of what teaching entails. We usually think of teachers as these people who have a head full of knowledge, and their job is to get that knowledge from their brain to the student's brain. And that certainly can be part of what teaching is about, but the reality is a little bit different. Teachers' job is much more to ensure that learning happens than that teaching occurs. So it's not about getting information from my head to the student's head. It's about figuring out how the student can acquire and learn information, regardless of whether it's me teaching them or not. So let me explain with a story from my own teaching experience. I was a K-12 teacher, a high school teacher in science classes, and science is a really big subject. So there's certain things that I would teach that I feel really comfortable with. There's certain things that I would teach that I'm not really comfortable with, and there's frankly things I taught that I didn't really know at all. And what I had to do before prepping those lessons was go and find resources so that I can learn the particular thing that I was teaching. So I would find videos, I would find websites, I would look in a science book, I would look at all the materials that my district gave me, I would learn it, and then I would create my lesson. At some point it dawned on me, and I'm sure it dawns on a lot of teachers, why, if I'm the one finding these resources, can't I simply set up a way for children and learners to find these resources? And then my job is less as a knower of information and more as a coach. And that's the way I think we need to think about teaching. Let's illustrate with a second story. A few months ago now, Jennifer Lopez, the famous actress, dancer, singer, made headlines when she was pretty open about being stressed out during this new emergency homeschooling situation. And particularly it was in regard to math. So before her kids were in school, they were learning math from teachers. And now their kids are at home, and Jennifer Lopez was open about not feeling like she knew the math that kids were supposed to learn. So it was hard for her because I think she imagined, like most of us do, that our job as teachers is to know things first and then teach it to kids. But just like we mentioned with myth one, there are a lot of places you can go to get resources. And in fact, when I was a teacher, I utilized a lot of those resources to learn the things I was supposed to teach myself. So maybe the job is a little bit different, that instead of necessarily teaching directly to students, maybe the job of a teacher should be more like a coach. So think of it this way. Most of us think that what we do is we go into a teacher, the teacher knows something, they give us a lesson on it, and their job is to take it from their head into our head. And maybe the teacher is sort of like a conduit, a middleman between the resources that are available and the student. So if a student is trying to learn something, maybe what the teacher should do is find ways to coach them through finding resources, learning those resources, and mastering those resources. And that doesn't require that the teacher actually know what it is that's being learned. So instead of teaching a direct lesson where I teach you how mitosis works, what we do instead is have a sort of a conversation that looks like the conversation here. Let's say the student is asking, how do I learn mitosis? And you as the parent/teacher, be honest. I really don't know anything about mitosis. Let's figure out what we know about mitosis, and then maybe we can find resources. Where should we go to find resources? And then the student says, well, we could go here. Cool, let's try that. All right, we found some resources. Where else could we go? Well, we could go here. Cool, let's try that. And then now the student might try learning through some of those resources. And if they get to a point where they're confused, they might say, well, I'm confused about this. Can you help me? You, again, be very honest and say, well, I really don't know this area. Let me look at the video and see if I can help out. And then maybe they'll ask you some questions about, did you understand it? And you say, well, either yes, you did or no, you didn't. And if you didn't, you work on it together. You maybe look at other resources. But the job here is that you as a teacher should be more of a coach rather than an actual instructor. So the way I like to think of it is that you are supporting their learning process because you are kind of an expert learner. As an adult, you've learned a lot of stuff. Whether you've learned mitosis, you've learned a lot of stuff. And your job is to take your expertise in how to learn things, not the subject matter, and get the student to kind of walk through that process and help the student along that way. I think it's a lot less intimidating to think of that way, that sometimes if you know a subject, yes, you can teach a student, but don't feel, as Jennifer Lopez felt, like you have to know all of the math or the science or social studies that you're teaching your kids before they can learn it. Your job can also be to be that middleman between them and resources. Another myth that largely comes to us about learning from school is that learning is best done on a particular schedule, that it's what we would call tempered, that it has a logical progression to it. You start here, you go there, and there's a certain sequence and time that it should take you to get through that learning. And the reality is that when you look at learning, especially outside of school, learning doesn't really fit very well often onto a schedule. We often learn things in fairly unpredictable ways. We might learn something when we need to learn it, or we might get a sudden burst of inspiration to learn, or we might find that a certain thing takes us longer than other things, or that other people might have in learning that. So learning is very different depending on the person. Just listen to our friend Tegan here, who's now age 20, and Tegan's reporting on her homeschool experience. And Tegan says something that's very typical of homeschoolers and unschoolers. She reports spending 6 months or so studying almost nothing but the history of Tudor England just because she was interested in it. And well, unschoolers have the time to do it because no one's telling them that spending 6 months on Tudor England is too long and we need to move on to other things. Whereas someone else might study Tudor England for a day or two and get their fill, or other people may really not be excited about studying Tudor England and have to be kind of dragged to do it kicking and screaming. So different people are going to be different, and learning isn't really the sort of thing that happens best on a schedule. If you think about why we have schedules at school, it has nothing to do with learning. We have grade level schedules, we have semesterly schedules, we have daily schedules, and all of this has to do with keeping schools running in an efficient way and in a way that all sorts of kids can be quote unquote on the same page, because when you get done with third grade, every third grader is supposed to know certain things to move on to fourth grade, et cetera, et cetera. And by the time you get to this standardized test, everyone's supposed to know the same stuff. And also we have a building, and we need to make sure that everyone learns 45 minutes in this room, 45 minutes in the math room, 45 minutes in the phys ed room. And again, this has nothing to do with good learning practice. This has everything to do with keeping schools running in an orderly way where they can be quote unquote at scale, which means have a lot of kids in the same place and not everyone simply kind of doing their own stuff. And as an example, I like to give my own students to illustrate the point. Think about if you had a week and a half entirely to yourself. You didn't have to work. You didn't have to really do anything. And you could learn anything you wanted to along the way. Would you go along with some schedule that says, well, from 10 to 11 o'clock, I'm going to learn a little bit of cooking. But at 11 o'clock, I'm going to stop no matter where I was in that learning. And I'm going to go and learn a musical instrument that I want to learn. And I'm going to do that from 11 to 12. And at 12, I'm going to eat, regardless of whether I'm hungry or not. And I'm only going to do that until 1:15. And then at 1:15, I'm going to do a little bit of art or ceramics or something. The answer is probably no. I think a few people would probably do a schedule like that. Some people really are comforted by schedules. But most people would kind of take it as it goes. Maybe you're interested in cooking something, but maybe you find that you're so interested that you spend 2 hours doing it. Or maybe you want to read a book, but you're so engrossed in the book that time slips by and you don't really pay attention. And as soon as you know, 3 hours have gone by. That's pretty typical. And when you look at people learning outside of school, that's kind of typically how it happens. Or it could be that you're not really a morning person, that you think you're clearest in the early afternoon or after lunch or maybe in the evening, whereas someone else might be a morning person and not an evening person. But at school, we insist that everyone starts learning as soon as that first bell rings, regardless of whether that time is really their best time of the day. To see how learning works very differently from schooling, let's go and look at a physical science textbook. And here's a typical kind of chapter layout. And if a child was in school, and again, I taught science, we would usually be going through the textbook roughly in the order that the textbook tells us to. So we're going to do chemistry first, and we're going to do the basic chapter first, and then build on that with chapter 2, and build on that with chapter 3. And then we're going to go into physics, and then we're going to go on earth space science. And notice that we're not really spending any more time on one of these areas than we are the other. So we do one chapter, we move on. We do the next chapter, we move on. Again, most people, if left free to learn, probably won't learn that way. In fact, if you're interested in, let's say, science, you're probably more interested in some of these things on this textbook chapter or textbook table of contents than other things. And you'll probably want to go to those things first. And you'll probably want to spend as much time as possible on those chapters because that's what you're interested in. And probably what's going to happen is that chapter will lead you to be interested or curious about something else. Maybe you can't understand this particular thing without understanding what's in chapter 4. So then you go into chapter 4 and maybe you spend some time there. But again, you're not going to set a schedule and say, I am only going to give myself 3 days to master chapter 3, and then I'll move on. You'll probably just look, and it takes as long as it takes. Well, that's the way learning most naturally occurs, but that's just not the way learning happens in this textbook. So let's get a little bit more into how learning really does occur outside of school environments. So here's an example from my own experience that is very different from that physical science textbook. I recently had to learn a software called Audacity. It's an audio recording software. And I know some people, if they were learning this technology, would go to a bunch of websites first and get some instructions and read the instructions. And once they feel like they have it, then they would start with the basics of Audacity. I know some people who would even be comfortable doing this learning very sequentially. Do this video first, then try that out in Audacity, then do the next video, then try that out, and do it in a step-by-step progression. That's really not how I tend to learn. So what I did is I went into Audacity and just started messing around, seeing what I could do without any instruction at all. And at some point, I would hit a snag, hit a wall where I couldn't do something because I didn't know how to do it. At that point, and only at that point, would I go online and maybe I would watch a video. And then I would come back to Audacity, I'd try out what I learned in the video. If that worked, cool. I'll start messing around a little bit more, and that opens up new possibilities. And then, again, I hit a snag, another snag. So now I figure out, okay, now I got to learn that. So now I'll look at a video or a website for that new skill, and then I'll go and do that. So this learning is what we call recursive learning. I didn't learn Audacity in a very linear way where I started with the basics, then I mastered those, then I went on to step 2, then I learned that, and then I went on to step 3. I really just kind of jumped in, and often I would kind of jump in on step 2 or 3, and only when I felt like I need to go back and learn step 1 because I didn't know something about step 1 would I do that. And the reason it's called recursive is because it happens in a sort of loop. You learn something, and then you need to go back and relearn something else. You go back and do that, then you go forward again. So that's called recursive learning. Another way that learning is not very linear is jagged learning, and this is probably best illustrated by video games. So let's say you have a video game with several levels on it. Level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. Now in school, each of those levels should ideally take you the same amount of time. 2 days for level 1, 2 days for level 2, 2 days for level 3, 2 days for level 4. What really happens, generally speaking, is that level 1, let's say, is a breeze for this person. And then level 2 is really hard. So level 1 takes maybe 1 day, but level 2 takes about 4 days to master. But once you have level 2 down, level 3 becomes pretty easy because you learned a lot of skills in level 2 that help you with level 3. So then you get through that. And then level 4 is pretty average. It takes you about 2 days. Well, there could be another person who really has a trouble with level 1, whereas you breeze through it. And level 2, which you struggled with, they would breeze through. Learning isn't really predictable that way. It's really hard to figure out what kind of schedule each person is going to take in terms of mastering something. And in fact, one of the criticisms against school learning has always been, if you don't master chapter 3 by the time you take the test, chapter 4 is going to be all that more difficult, but everyone has to move on. The good thing about home learning is that you don't have to move on. You can stay on chapter 3 if you want to. And if you don't trust me, here are two folks who have studied a lot of learning outside of school. On the left, John Holt. On the right, Theodore Sizer, who basically say the same thing. When you look at how learning really works, it doesn't seem to go the way school wants it to, which is this nice linear progression. Learning is idiosyncratic. Learning is jagged. Learning is recursive. So we've explored 3 particular myths about learning from a schooled culture. The first is that learning doesn't actually have to take place in a place that looks anything like school. Learning can be all around us. There's learning opportunities and resources everywhere. Myth number 2 is that learning doesn't have to take place by a teacher spilling the knowledge from their heads into a student. Your job as a teacher can also be to ensure that your student's learning and be more like a coach than an instructor. And number 3, learning doesn't really have to and often doesn't really take place best on a schedule. You can be a lot looser with your schedule. Now, I think that we have these myths about learning for the same reason the alien had myths about eating. When you look at only eating in restaurants, you pick up certain things about eating that are really particular to restaurants. That doesn't represent eating everywhere, just like the way learning looks in school does not represent how learning looks everywhere. Learning at home is going to look way different than learning at school. So my overall advice is to take this opportunity to allow the process to be messy and not look like it would in school. And for the first time in your child's learning life, maybe they are in charge of their own learning. They have the authority to choose the resources they're going to learn from. And instead of having a teacher teaching to them, have a coach like yourself sort of coaching them. And maybe they can figure out a schedule that works best for them. They can take more time on things they need to take more time on. They can breeze through things that they find easy. They can follow their interests and passions. It's not going to look like school. And you know what? That's okay.